Look around these halls, stranger. Take in these vases, these tapestries, these creaking statues and broken mosaics. They all have stories, these things. Stories that I shall relate to you. I'll be as truthful as I can, though sometimes my memory slips, and some of the stories passed down to me have become confused in repetition or embellished by poets, or were never true to begin with. And besides, some of the things I shall tell you, they're so astonishing you may not believe them anyway. Many cities will fall in this story. Few will be as magnificent as Babylon, once the largest city in the world. A city where gardens grew from rooftops, nourished by the sparkling Euphrates, which flowed right through Babylon's heart. A city ringed by lapis blue walls and gates that bore the names of gods. Darius, newly crowned king of the Persians, was not here to admire the sights. The Babylonians rejected the rule of Darius, and so he responded as Persian kings do, with thunderous wrath. From their vast realm, the Persians brought forth every tool of destruction they could muster. Looming siege towers, battering rams with heads of iron, arrows wrapped in burning flax. To Babylon, the Persians brought death. You may have the impression that Darius was nothing but a violent conqueror. And indeed, he crushed all who opposed him with brutal force. But he was also an admirable administrator. Once the slaughter was over, he divided his empire into provinces known as satrapies, to be governed by trusted men. On the western edge of the empire lay the satrapy of Lydia, which Darius gave to his half-brother, Artaphernes. A remote posting, though not an unpleasant one. Lydia was a wealthy land of fine horses, gold-bearing rivers, and wine to rival any Mediterranean vintage. Along Lydia's western coast was a region called Ionia, and here dwelt Greeks, who many centuries ago had planted colonies along the Ionian shore. These Greeks rarely caused trouble for their Persian masters, and so long as they paid their tribute on time, the Persians were happy to leave their foreign subjects to their own devices. Enter Aristagoras, ruler of the Greek city of Miletus, a man whose ambitions regularly outstripped his capacities. His head filled with imagined glories, Aristagoras went to the court of the satrap Artaphernes and proposed a scheme to his master. If the Persians would provide Aristagoras with a fleet, he would conquer the island of Naxos for the great king. Artaphernes was intrigued. Naxos was a gem that would surely please his half-brother the king. And so Artaphernes summoned all that the expedition might require: shipwrights and steersmen, baggage handlers and quartermasters, cedar wood for triremes and cornel wood for spears, plump goats for eating, and white lambs for sacrifice. A glorious conquest seemed sure to follow. Having squandered the great king's fleet, Aristagoras rightly feared for his head and most of his other body parts. But fear can make men do unexpected things. Rather than flee, Aristagoras launched a rebellion. Aristagoras knew that he'd need all the men he could muster. He sailed to Greece with a bronze map that showed the rich Persian realm, hoping to tempt would-be fortune-seekers from their rocky homeland. The cautious Spartans refused to get involved, but the Athenians, who are fond both of great adventures and reckless decisions, were easily persuaded. Returning with these Athenian treasure hunters, Aristagoras marched across Ionia, rallying cities to his cause and deposing any rulers who remained loyal to the Persians. Now, there are some who think that Aristagoras was a true freedom fighter, committed to Greek liberty. Others say he acted out of desperation or embarrassment. Others think he wanted only greater power for himself. Whatever the truth may be, Artaphernes' once peaceful satrapy was now the site of a major rebellion led by a man with nothing left to lose. The army of Aristagoras, a rowdy band of desperate rebels, committed freedom fighters and avaricious fortune seekers, now made its boldest move yet. They descended upon Sardis, the mighty capital of Lydia itself, where Artaphernes governed in luxury. Like wolves ravaging a flock of lambs, the Greeks swarmed through the streets, overwhelming the unprepared garrison. Artaphernes watched on in horror. How had Aristagoras, who couldn't take tiny Naxos even with a Persian armada on his side, swept into Sardis uncontested? In what seemed like mere moments, the Greeks had seized the whole of Sardis, all except the Acropolis, where Artaphernes prepared to make his stand. Fire is sacred to the Persians. In fire they see the light and truth of their supreme god, Ahura Mazda. So imagine their horror as they watch the holy shrines of Sardis go up in flames. Imagine their fear as they fought the pitiless blaze. Imagine their anger as Aristagoras fled the city with his Greek marauders. Whether it was arson or accident, the burning of Sardis would spark untold horrors for both the Greeks and Persians. Invasions, massacres, slaughters, sieges. All these things I will relate to you in good time. Artaphernes had no notion of what great and terrible events were to come. He was focused purely on bringing the treacherous Aristagoras to justice. His face still blackened with ash, Artaphernes gathered his swiftest riders and rode out after the rebels at a furious gallop. Like a boxer sent reeling by an unexpected blow, who then turns on his foe with renewed fury, Artaphernes landed his first counterblow to the rebellion at Ephesus. The Persians fully expected this uprising to shatter at the first sign of adversity. And yet the Greeks continued to resist. Artaphernes knew what had to be done. He directed the full might of Persia against Miletus, home city of Aristagoras and epicenter of the rebellion. This was no small undertaking. Miletus was a mighty metropolis, famed for its wealth. From its bustling harbour, Miletus had seeded the shores of the Black Sea with dozens of colonies. Now that harbour hosted the entire Ionian navy, its triremes bristling with fierce Greek marines. A formidable target. But Artaphernes was well acquainted with the endless squabbles of his former subjects, and knew that with a single loose thread, he could unravel the entire Greek alliance. Artaphernes soon found just such a thread. The Greek sailors were on the verge of mutiny, having been driven to exhaustion by the endless drills of their relentless admiral, Dionysius. Artaphernes had found the soft underbelly of Miletus. Now, he made ready to slit it open. With the capture of Miletus, the Greek rebellion shattered. The burning of Sardis still fresh in their minds, the Persians brutally stamped out the last isolated remnants of the uprising. taking cleansing fire to cities, fields, and sanctuaries. Ash and blackened bones were the only remaining testaments to the hubris of Aristagoras. For most men, this would have been vengeance enough. But for the great king of Persia, retribution had to be absolute. If a single rebel was seen to escape punishment, then Darius would soon be dealing with recalcitrant Bactrians, or the arrogant Babylonians again, or the Egyptians, for whom peace was simply an interlude between uprisings. No, there was still one enemy unpunished. Men who had sailed all the way across the Aegean just to pillage the great king's realm. 3 times each night at dinner, Darius had a servant whisper in his ear, "Master, remember the Athenians." So the great king ordered the construction of a mighty fleet and entrusted it to his most dependable commander, Datis. At the first fluttering of the Etesian winds, Datis launched his deep-bellied warships into the Aegean, their prows pointed for Greece. In those days, most fleets would travel along the coastline, returning to shore each night. But Datis had a different plan. He would cut a bloody swathe straight through the islands of the Aegean, starting with Naxos, where, all those years ago, the failure of Aristagoras had birthed such troubles for the Greeks. Such was the fury of the Persians. Such was the vengeance they exacted on traitors, oath-breakers, and temple burners. And though the Athenians had sent only 20 ships to aid the Ionians, they too would face the great king's wrath. Panic spread throughout Athens. At this time, the city was far from the grand metropolis it would later become. It had no navy, no empire, no Parthenon. Even its democracy was barely 2 decades old. Yet now, like a storm-tossed fishing boat facing a towering wave, little Athens was on the brink of being engulfed. Like good Democrats, the Athenians elected their generals, 10 each year, and it was these men who now debated what to do. Among these generals was Aristides. Aristides the Just, they called him. As upright a man as you'll ever meet, his commitment to his city faultless. And then there was Themistocles, his lifelong rival. Themistocles was an outsider from an obscure family. He was a radical, audacious in thinking, and he was a schemer who never put justice ahead of expediency. But in this desperate hour, these ambitious men agreed that the bold Miltiades should take supreme command. Miltiades ordered the Athenians to muster at the plain of Marathon, there to await the Persians. There was little time left to prepare. Across the Euboean Gulf, the Athenians watched the Persians burn Eretria and knew they were next. Marathon was a stunning victory. Those who fought there became known as the Marathonomachoi. Among them, the great tragedian Aeschylus, whose tombstone never bothers to mention his dramas, only his glorious involvement at Marathon. With the enemy vanquished, the Athenians slept soundly. All except Themistocles, who yearned for the glory that went to Miltiades. Not that Miltiades remained a hero very long. The next year he made a dreadful mess of an expedition to Paros, was promptly thrown in prison by the angry Athenians, and died shortly thereafter from a gangrenous leg wound. Great men, you see, rarely meet great ends. Lack of recognition wasn't the only thing that kept Themistocles awake at night. He knew that the Persians would soon return, and Athens was utterly unprepared. So when the Athenians struck a rich vein of silver, Themistocles proposed something radical. They should spend it on a fleet of warships, and transformed their unremarkable city into a naval power. His rival Aristides disagreed, as you might expect. The Persian threat was gone, he argued, and fleets of squalid things rowed by squalid men. The Athenians had a wonderfully efficient way to resolve disputes like these: an ostracism. Unlike regular elections, where the Athenians voted eagerly for whoever made them the most extravagant promises, in an ostracism, the citizens voted to expel whichever politician they found most disagreeable. This was Themistocles' opportunity. If he could get his stubborn rival Aristides ostracized, he could have his fleet and his chance at glory. Just as Themistocles predicted, the Persians were readying another invasion. King Darius had died, but his son Xerxes was no less warlike. Indeed, he sought not just to punish Athens, but to conquer the whole of Greece. This new great king summoned all the forces of the vast Persian realm: axe-wielding Sakai, Syrians with helmets of twisted bronze, Ethiopians draped in leopard skins and armed with palmwood bows. At the Hellespont, they gathered in their thousands. A host so enormous it drank rivers dry. The great king ordered a bridge of boats constructed between Europe and Asia. The two continents yoked together like ill-matched oxen. Xerxes would force the sea itself to bend to his will. The Greeks called an urgent council. Many cities had already submitted to Xerxes, offering the earth and water he demanded. But other cities resolved to fight. They pledged to unite their forces and cease their feuds with one another. A most extraordinary thing for Greeks to do, you understand. Together, the allied Greek cities devised a plan. King Leonidas of Sparta would march to the mountain pass of Thermopylae, there to await the Persian army. Meanwhile, Themistocles and the Greek fleet would make their stand at the Strait of Artemisium. With the narrow terrain on their side, and desperation coursing through their veins, the Greeks hoped to halt the Persian flood, or dam it, long enough to buy time. With their city now completely exposed to the Persian invaders, the desperate Athenians turned to the god Apollo for advice. At Delphi, Apollo's priestess, always a wise, graceful woman, would give voice to the god's prophecies in cryptic riddles. On this occasion, her advice to the Athenians was unusually clear and utterly terrifying. Flee, she told them. Flee to the ends of the earth. The Athenians begged for a second audience. Apollo, apparently forgiving this impertinence, now offered one ray of hope. Whatever else may occur, intoned his priestess, the wooden wall would remain intact. This was very encouraging, until the Athenians realized that they had no idea what the wooden wall was supposed to be. Some argued that it meant the palisade around the Acropolis, and wanted to make their stand there, but Themistocles persuaded the Athenians otherwise. The wooden wall, he said, meant the fleet. And so the people of Athens extinguished their hearths, left behind the tombs of their ancestors, and trudged down to the harbour at Piraeus, there to board the fleet with all they could carry. After ferrying the women and children across the Saronic Gulf, the fleet moored in the Bay of Salamis with the rest of the Greek allies. There, they watched with anguish as the Persians marched into Athens and torched their undefended homes. Like bulls who reach the sacrificial altar and spook at the baying crowd below, the allies began to panic. Many wished to flee. But there was to be no escape. The Persians blockaded both exits from the Straits of Salamis, trapping the Greek fleet. There are some who say that it was the scheming Themistocles himself who tipped off the great king, forcing his allies to stand alongside him. I know not whether this is true, but I do know that Themistocles would do anything for his people. Now, trapped in the Straits of Salamis, the Greeks had only two options: victory or death. Like a hunter who at last looms over a cornered boar, only for the desperate beast to turn and gore him, Xerxes was stunned by the Greek victory. Themistocles seized this advantage. He tricked the great king once again, sending word that the Greeks would sail to the Hellespont and destroy the Persians' bridge back to Asia. Having seen quite enough of Greece already, Xerxes fled as fast as his palanquin bearers could carry him. The Greeks, who usually loved nothing more than fighting each other, had seen what could be achieved through unity. Headed by Pausanias, regent king of Sparta, they formed a grand alliance. Its goal was not simply to defend Greece, but to carry the war across the Aegean into the great king's domain. Their first target was an audacious one: Cyprus, deep within Persian waters. Only the Phoenicians and Egyptians supplied more ships to Xerxes than the many kingdoms of Cyprus. And so a Greek armada sailed eastwards, the likes of which none had seen since the days of Agamemnon. An endless tapestry of sails, bearing the proud symbols of cities large and small. Across the wine-dark sea they came, heading straight for the heart of the Persian realm. The Greeks were in high spirits. How could they not be, after the miraculous victory at Salamis, and then the daring strike against Cyprus? And so for their next target, they chose Byzantium. No mere city, but a gateway between continents. Its harbors crowded with merchants from 100 different lands. But trouble loomed over the Greek fleet. The Spartan leader Pausanias began to treat the allies as a despot treats his slaves, using threats in place of persuasion, issuing demands rather than seeking counsel. The allies, enraged by the arrogance of Pausanias, whispered their protest to that most incorruptible of statesmen, the Athenian Aristides. And Aristides, whether irked by injustice or sensing an opportunity for Athens, or perhaps imbibing some of Themistocles' talent for scheming, began to wonder whether Athens, not Sparta, should lead the Greek alliance. Accusations rose against Pausanias until Sparta finally recalled him, and into the waiting arms of Athens, the allies willingly came. The Athenians formed a new alliance, the Delian League. Each year, its members would send Athens either money or ships for the common defense. Most chose coin, and so from many small streams, a torrent of wealth began to flow into Athens. Athenian power now surpassed even Themistocles' most ambitious dreams. From a hastily assembled fleet to mastery of a mighty league. You might imagine that Themistocles would be terrifically popular after all of this. But that's not how things work in Athens. His jealous rivals stood by, plotting his fall. And as the years went on, Athens too incurred the suspicion of her allies. With the Persian threat repelled, they asked, why should they continue to pay their tribute to Athens? The winds of the Aegean were thick with discontent. And so the Delian League became the Athenian Empire. And Themistocles, like all who become great in Athens, suffered his fall. Exiled from his home by jealous rivals, he ended up volunteering his services to none other than the great king of Persia, who reasoned that the Persians' greatest foe might prove their most useful servant. So Themistocles ended his days a loyal subject of the Mede. As I said, great men rarely meet great ends. Decades passed. The Athenian Empire grew to new heights under the wise statesman Pericles, who governed with his beloved Aspasia at his side. Athens, burnt to a husk mere decades earlier, was now a marvelous metropolis, resplendent in glittering marble, prosperous and confident. The city of Athena nurtured a golden age of art, philosophy, and architecture. But the days when Athens fought side by side with Sparta were long gone. Greece fractured into two great powers, the Athenian Empire and the Peloponnesian League, circling each other like yellow-eyed wolves. One hardly needed the foresight of Apollo to see that war was coming. On land, none could resist the Spartans, whose men devoted their whole lives to war. At sea, the Athenian fleet was unmatched, and with Athens connected to its port by a set of long walls, the navy could feed the city indefinitely, should any foe attempt a siege. All Greece held its breath, like an audience that awaits the arrival of a tragic chorus, knowing that things both great and terrible are about to unfold. The plague killed Pericles, and with him Athens' steady hand. Perhaps Pericles was fortunate in a way. He died at the height of his fame, before he could suffer the inevitable downfall of great men in Athens. But enough of Athens. Let me tell you of the Peloponnese, homeland of the Spartans, where jagged mountains loom over plains riven by earthquakes. All along its rugged coastline came Athenian raiders. Triremes drove their bronze-clad prows onto Peloponnesian shores, vengeful hoplites swarming out like hornets. For the most part, the Spartans were unsuited to deal with these raids. They've always been a slow, ponderous people. The dashing general Brasidas, however, was no typical Spartan. Energetic, gregarious, eloquent, sharp in thought and quick in action. When Athenian raiders came to Methone, the town cried out for just such a savior. If only Brasidas could make it in time. The Spartans hailed Brasidas as a hero. In the early days of the war, when their futile occupation of Attica dragged on and the expected victory never came, Brasidas was a rare figure of inspiration, the protector of Spartan honor against vicious Athenian pirates. But the Athenian raids endangered more than Sparta's honor. Turmoil in the Peloponnese threatened the very foundations of Spartan society. Centuries earlier, you see, the Spartans had marched across the mountains into Messenia, conquered its entire people, and forced them into perpetual serfdom. Hereafter, the Messenians were called Helots, and toiled year-round for their Spartan masters. The Spartans were utterly dependent on these Helots, as dependent as they were fearful, for they knew that given the slightest chance, the Helots would gladly eat their masters alive. Like a field of dry heather, the Peloponnese would need only a tiny spark to burst into flames. And the Athenian raiders knew it. Brasidas donned his helmet, its horsehair crest swaying in the salty breeze, and marched down to the coast. The Spartans fought off raid after raid, but they knew that the black-bellied ships would keep coming, unless they could force the Athenians to direct their attention elsewhere. An opportunity soon presented itself, courtesy of a suggestion from the wily Macedonian king, Perdiccas. He brought word that many of Athens' allies in the far north were wavering in their commitment. Ripe fruit, perhaps, to be plucked from the enemy alliance. Quite the trek for most Spartans, who spend as little time away from their homeland as possible. But Brasidas was not like most Spartans. He gathered an army, its strength bolstered by thousands of helots, to whom he promised freedom in exchange for brave service. Northwards they marched, the red-cloaked Spartans at their head, ready to plunge their spears into the Athenian Empire's naked flank. Brasidas lived just long enough to hear that he was victorious. This, for the Greeks, is the perfect way to die, expiring at the very height of one's glory. Some say that there was something in Brasidas that sought death, that yearned for it. Not for him a quiet senescence tending his vines. He would die with Ares watching. The Greeks are always at war with each other, but they usually resolve things quickly. They find a suitable plain, line up opposite each other, and settle their disagreement in a single brutal clash. But this new, interminable kind of war was exhausting. And with the deaths of Brasidas and Cleon, both Sparta and Athens had lost their most energetic leaders. So they took to diplomacy and signed a peace treaty that was to last for 50 years. They were fighting again within a decade. And the Athenians, always quick to make terrible decisions, resolved that the surest path to victory was to open up an entirely unnecessary new front in Sicily, of all places. The Athenians tried to enclose the Sicilian capital of Syracuse within a vast stone wall. To stop this, the Syracusans tried to intercept them with a counterwall of their own. This is about the height of Greek siegecraft, I'm afraid. After months of this walling and counter-walling, the Syracusans' resolve began to waver. But just in time, reinforcements arrived from Sparta. The Sicilian expedition was planned hastily, executed incompetently, and concluded horrifically. The Athenians were chased from Syracuse all the way to the river Asinarus, where they were speared like writhing tuna in the blood-churned water. This defeat should have spelled the end of the Athenian Empire. But like the many-headed Hydra, Athens recovered from every wound. For as long as they could hide behind their walls, supplied from the sea, the Athenians would never surrender. Lysander knew this. When Sparta made him admiral of a fleet that didn't yet exist, well, it seemed like the latest insult in a lifetime of derision. But Lysander was determined. He knew that Sparta needed a navy, and that required money. Real money. Not the iron spits that the austere Spartans used as currency. So Lysander sailed to Ionia to meet with the young Persian prince, Cyrus. He struck a deal with the old enemy, Persian gold for a Spartan fleet, and the troublesome Athenian navy reduced to splinters. Like a razor-beaked hawk, Swooping down on a crowd of startled jackdaws, Lysander shattered the unsuspecting Athenian fleet. At long last, the navy that shielded Athens from the horrors of siege was vanquished. Lysander bore down on Athens, determined to have his victory, but not before driving every Athenian garrison out of Asia Minor, so that their city would be packed with hungry mouths. No fleet, no hesitancy, no law, human or divine, stood between Lysander and the triumph he sought. Proud Athens, which had once gorged itself on the fruits of its empire, now starved. Sallow-faced and trembling, the Athenians begged Lysander to lift his siege. To make sure that Athens would always remain at his mercy, Lysander tore down the long walls to the mocking music of flute girls. Lysander finally had his victory, and he made sure it was never forgotten. At Delphi, the center of the Greek world, he had himself sculpted in bronze. But, as you must have learnt by now, great men rarely meet great ends. And before long, Lysander was dead, his legacy scorned by the kings he served, his memory blackened with accusations of arrogance, violence, and greed. You might think that after spending nearly 3 decades at war, the Greeks would settle down, at least for a little while. Alas, they were at each other's throats again soon enough. Endless configurations of cities in alliances and leagues and empires, fighting for gold or territory or honor, or sometimes for no good reason at all. No. The Greeks would never stand together by choice, only by necessity or compulsion. And indeed, the day would soon come when unity would be forced upon them by a man whose cunning eclipsed Themistocles, whose swiftness was greater than Brasidas, whose ruthlessness was beyond even Lysander, and whose ambitions were a match for any king who ever lived. But I grow weary now. Return on the morrow, and I shall continue our tale.